Let's begin. Imagine this: a long line of men, all shackled in chains, slowly progressing forward. At the front of the line stands an executioner, who, one by one, strikes down each and every man. The men in line have to watch as they know within themselves they will succumb to the same fate quickly. Also imagine another image. A man walking on a bridge suddenly stops in his track, puts his hands to his face, his mouth gapes open, and he screams in absolute horror. These two images say something profound about mortality, about the depths of the brutality of death. The first image is called the Allegory of the Men in Chains, presented by Blaise Pascal in his Pensées. The second comes from a popular painting by Edward Munch, a Dutch artist, called The Scream. These two images in tandem help us understand how death affects us psychologically, and also help us understand the context of Western social mores regarding mortality. This brings us to today's prompt, which is, in what ways do today's industries and economic practices shape, affect, or dictate Western social mores regarding mortality? I'm going to answer this prompt in three main ways today. First of all, I'm going to go into a little more of an analysis of what Western social mores regarding mortality are. We'll give a little sneak peek into that because it's a very rich subject. Secondly, I will discuss economic practices and institutions and how those do and do not shape or affect Western social mores. And lastly, I'm going to link materialism to this subject, and specifically the advent of advertising as something that propagates materialism and feeds the vicious cycle by which the West has failed to cope with death. All right, going back to Pascal. Now, Pascal didn't just talk about the brutality of death. He also talked about how we fail to cope with it. And he said, I quote, "Men only want to be happy, but the best way to do this would be to make themselves immortal. And as they cannot do this, they have decided to stop thinking about it." Death is so terrifying that we simply want to get away from it. Pascal postulated his theory of divergence, of anything that fills empty space, as something that distracts us from death and draws us away from mortality. Something that drowns out the scream, as Munch displays in his popular painting. This brings to mind a quotation by Bertrand Russell, one of the pioneers of modern analytical philosophy. He said that all is passing in this mad, monstrous world. All is struggling to snatch, at any moment, moments of life before death's inexorable decree. We try so hard to find happiness in this life, but so often those little moments are simply diversions, distractions away from what we truly need to see. What we need to see, as Munch displayed, is that death is simply brutal. Now, this is a general context of Western social mores regarding mortality. Granted, it's a small snippet, but it's a context nonetheless. Nextly, I'll transition into my discussion of economic practices and industries. I first want to give a small caveat. I want to strongly disagree with the notion that any industry or institution affects social morality directly. Those institutions are mere feedback loops or channels by which we communicate our own needs and desires. This goes back to the scriptures in Romans 3:23, when Paul said, "All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Culpability for false coping mechanisms for death are placed on us and none other. This goes contrary to Marxian theory, and also contrary to the theory of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a classical French political philosopher, who asserted that governments and institutions can change our very nature. And Marx carried this theory on through his writings. However, I would like to disagree with this and say that it perpetuates the vicious cycle of turning us away from mortality, of diverting our attention away and blaming it on an institution. Now, getting into my discussion of materialism, I'd like to actually, surprisingly enough, commend Marx on a few points. Firstly, he mentioned something very interesting about how the modern economy goes far beyond the principle of subsistence. Now, the notion of subsistence goes back to Adam Smith himself, the father of modern economics. And that is the basic notion that men in an economy need basic things to live and to thrive. We need to subsist. Well, one of Marx's main critiques of capitalism is that we've gone way far beyond that. We don't need all these fancy things. We don't need luxurious things. And you and I can think of examples of these things on the cuff. Apple computers, European clothing, what have you. We don't need these things. And they're far beyond subsistence. And Marx argues that that is one of the main problems with capitalism and Western economics. My second commendation of Marx is his theory of commodity fetishism. This ties directly into materialism and says something very profound about what commodities look like in a modern economy. He argued that commodities take on, and I quote, a sort of metaphysical subtlety, theological nicety. In our modern Western economy, we look to things and to objects to fill empty voids within us. And in the process, these things take on a sort of anthropomorphic character, a sort of life of their own that they don't have. Marx argued this is one of the reasons why you should abolish the private property. Now, this links directly to materialism, which is, in brief, the basic view that things will fill us and fill our souls and make us happy. The classic principle of happiness is postulated by Aristotle. The word eudaimonia means human fulfillment and absolute happiness in kind of a deep, broad sense. What materialism says is the answer to that is things, objects, commodities, whatever fills the empty space and drowns out the scream of death that so brutally imposes itself on our reality. Now, this materialism is specifically manifested in the advent of advertising. Advertising does something that economics in a statistical formulaic sense cannot do. Because as Stephen Rhodes said, the larger issues of a possible information bias or welfare loss of heavy advertising of goods and services receives little attention in major economic literature. What economist Stephen Rhodes here is saying is that economics doesn't think a lot about advertising because advertising is philosophical. Advertising says something about a product that's beyond mere formula, mere statistics, aggregate demand, and such. What Rhodes is saying here is that advertising has a sort of philosophical, spiritual, emotional character. This goes back to Marx and his main critique, one of his main critiques of capitalism. And in this sense, advertising propagates materialism. Theologian Ezra Mission said quite pithily, advertisers leave men restless and discontented by hinting continually that the big prizes in life are the things that money can buy. Now, why do advertisers do this? Well, because they have to. They're making money, they're making a buck, bringing home the bacon, if you will. But these advertisers can surely not be to blame for the vicious process of materialism that drowns out the scream of death and distracts us and diverts us from our mortality. No, advertising is merely a feedback loop. Now, if you can hear me for a second, I'll make a pop culture reference. Matthew Weiner's popular award-winning show, Mad Men, has a lot to say about advertising and its role in trying to fill human happiness and fill the void of mortality. Matthew Weiner described his protagonist, Don Draper, as a man who is plagued by his mortality, but who just wants to live, to do, and experience. In the first episode of the first season, Don says something extremely interesting about happiness and advertising and death, and I quote, "Advertising is about one thing, happiness. And you know what happiness is? It's the smell of a new car. It's freedom from fear. It's a billboard on the side of the road that screams, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. It's okay. You're okay." Advertising propagates materialism by trying to convince us that we can be happy by simply having material things. In closing, I want to bring you to a quote by the Russian author Leo Tolstoy. In Crime and Punishment, he stated, "Man cannot possess anything as long as he fears death. But to him who does not fear it, everything belongs." The fear of death keeps us from possessing true things, Materialism and advertising spin that vicious cycle and further draw us away from our mortal nature that, when we confront it, leads us to a greater, higher reality. And in this way, the scream of death, as exhibited by Edward Monk, can never, and indeed should never, be drowned out. Thank you.